The spring melt had turned the San Pedro River into a churning beast, and Flora Zimmerman stood alone at the crossing, gripping the ferry rope with hands that already ached from the morning's work. She had been operating this crossing for 3 weeks now, ever since her father took sick with pneumonia and could not leave his bed. And today, in 1882, the water ran higher and faster than she had ever seen it. The wooden platform beneath her boots shifted with each wave that crashed against its hull, and Flora knew she should have closed the crossing an hour ago, but the territory mail rider was due and he would need passage, and her family needed the money more than she needed to admit her own limitations. She was 21 years old and had grown up on this crossing, watching her father guide travelers back and forth across the San Pedro for as long as she could remember. The ferry itself was a simple flat-bottomed barge large enough for 2 horses and their riders, or a small wagon, connected to both banks by a heavy rope that ran through iron rings. The operator pulled hand over hand, using the current's angle to help push the ferry across. In normal conditions, Flora could manage it. In flood season, with the river swollen and angry, it took every ounce of strength she possessed. The male rider appeared on the eastern bank just after noon, his horse dancing nervously at the water's edge. Flora waved to signal she was coming across for him, then positioned herself at the rope. She pulled, feeling the current immediately fight her. The ferry lurched forward, water sloshing over the deck. Her shoulders burned as she hauled the rope, hand over hand, the rough hemp biting into her palms even through her work gloves. Halfway across, a surge of water hit the ferry broadside, spinning it slightly off course. Flora's arms shook with the effort of correcting, pulling harder, faster, sweat running down her back despite the cool spray of river water. She made it to the eastern bank, and the male rider led his nervous gelding aboard. "You should not be doing this alone, miss," he said, his weathered face creased with concern. "This river is not safe." "I know," Flora replied, catching her breath. "But my father cannot do it, and we cannot afford to close." She did not mention that her younger brother was only 16 and their mother had died 2 winters past. The ferry crossing was their livelihood, and if they lost it, they lost everything. The return journey was worse. The male rider's horse shifted its weight, making the ferry harder to balance. Flora pulled with everything she had, her arms trembling so badly she could barely maintain her grip. The muscles in her back screamed. Her vision blurred with the effort. She was 3/4 of the way across when she heard the thunder of hooves on the western bank. Through the spray and her own exhaustion, she saw a cowboy dismounting from a tall roan horse. He was broad-shouldered and moved with purpose, and before she could process what he was doing, he had waded into the shallows at the river's edge and grabbed the rope ahead of where it was anchored. His hands closed over the hemp just as Flora's strength was about to give out entirely. "I have got it," he called out, his voice carrying over the roar of the water. "Keep pulling, but let me take the weight." Flora did not have the breath to argue. She kept her grip on the rope, but felt the terrible strain ease as the stranger threw his weight into pulling. Together, they hauled the ferry the remaining distance. When the platform finally bumped against the western bank, Flora's legs nearly gave out. She steadied herself against the rope post, breathing hard, while the male rider led his horse off the ferry. The cowboy who had helped was perhaps 24 or 25, with dark hair that curled slightly at his collar and eyes the color of creek stones. He was soaked to the waist from wading into the river, but he paid it no mind as he stepped onto the ferry to face her. "You should not be running this crossing alone," he said, and though his words echoed the male rider's, his tone was different, not condescending, but genuinely worried. "That current nearly had you. "I know," Flora said again, because what else could she say? "But there is no one else." He studied her for a long moment, taking in her worn work dress, her soaked boots, her hands that still shook from exertion. "My name is Henry Thorne," he said. "I am on my way to Douglas, but I am in no particular hurry. How long has your father been sick?" The question caught her off guard. 3 weeks. "How did you—" "I came through here 2 months back, and a big fellow with a gray beard was running the ferry. I am guessing that was your father." Henry glanced at the swollen river, then back at her. "This flood will last another week at least, maybe 2. You cannot do this alone for that long." "I do not have a choice," Flora said, lifting her chin. "My family depends on this income. What if I helped you?" The offer came simply, without fanfare. "I can stay for a couple of weeks, help you run the ferry until the water goes down and your father recovers. You can pay me in meals and a place to sleep. I do not need much." Flora stared at him, trying to understand what motivated this offer from a complete stranger. "Why would you do that?" Henry's expression softened. "Because I watched your arms shaking from 50 yards away, and I knew if I did not grab that rope, you were going into the water. And because nobody should have to do this alone." He paused. "Also, my own mother ran a ferry after my father died back in Missouri. I know what it takes, and I know what it costs." Something in his voice when he mentioned his mother told Flora he understood more than most people would. She looked at the river, at the ferry, at her own trembling hands. Pride warred with practicality, but practicality won. "All right," she said, "but I am paying you properly. I will not take charity." "It is not charity if I am asking for the work," Henry replied. "Now, how about you show me how this operation runs, and we can make a plan for handling the rest of today's crossings." They worked together until sunset, and Flora discovered that Henry had not exaggerated his experience. He knew ferries, knew rivers, and moved with the kind of confident competence that came from real knowledge rather than bravado. When the current shifted, he adjusted his position without being told. When a nervous horse balked at boarding, he calmed it with a few quiet words and steady hands. And when Flora's strength flagged, he simply took more of the weight without making her feel inadequate. By the time they closed the crossing for the night, Flora felt more exhausted than she had in weeks, but also more hopeful. Henry followed her up the path to the small house that sat on the hill overlooking the crossing. Her father was awake, sitting up in bed, and his eyes sharpened with interest when Flora introduced her new helper. "Henry Thorne," her father repeated, his voice rough from coughing. "That name sounds familiar." "Where are you from?" "Springfield, Missouri, originally," Henry replied. "But I have been working cattle drives and ranch work throughout the territory for the past 6 years." Flora's younger brother, Frank, appeared in the doorway, his eyes widening at the sight of a stranger. He was a gangly youth, all elbows and knees, with their father's build but not yet the strength to match it. "Who is this?" he asked. "Someone who is going to help us keep the ferry running until Papa is well," Flora said firmly, cutting off any potential objection. "Frank, can you show Mr. Thorne where he can wash up, and then we will have supper." That first evening established a routine that would hold for the coming days. Henry slept in the small barn where they kept 2 mules and the chickens, and he proved to be as good as his word. He asked for little and worked hard, and Flora found herself grateful beyond measure for his presence. The ferry crossing in flood season was brutal work, and having someone who could share the load made it bearable. But it was more than just the physical help. As the days passed, Flora discovered that she enjoyed Henry's company. He had a dry sense of humor that surfaced at unexpected moments, and he listened when she talked, really listened, rather than just waiting for his turn to speak. In the evenings, after they had closed the crossing and eaten supper, they would sometimes sit on the porch while the last light faded from the sky, and they would talk about everything and nothing. "Why did you leave Missouri?" Flora asked one evening, nearly a week into his stay. Henry was quiet for a moment, his gaze on the darkening river. "My mother died 5 years ago," he said finally. "She had been running that ferry for 15 years, and it wore her down. After she passed, I sold the crossing to a neighbor and headed west. I could not stay there anymore, not with all those memories." "I am sorry," Flora said softly. "She was strong like you," Henry continued. "Stubborn too, would not accept help even when she needed it." He turned to look at Flora, and there was something in his eyes that made her breath catch. "Watching you try to haul that ferry alone that first day, it was like seeing her all over again. I could not just ride away." Flora felt heat rise in her cheeks and was grateful for the darkness that hid it. "I am glad you stayed," she said. The river continued its rampage for another week, and during that time, Flora and Henry fell into a partnership that felt as natural as breathing. They learned to read each other's movements, to anticipate when the other needed help, to work in the kind of silent coordination that usually took months to develop. Flora found herself watching Henry when she thought he was not looking, noticing the way his shoulders moved when he pulled the rope, the way his face creased when he smiled, the gentleness in his hands when he worked with the animals. She told herself it was merely appreciation for his help. She told herself she was being foolish, getting attached to a drifter who would leave as soon as the work was done. But her heart was not listening to her head, and with each passing day, she found it harder to imagine the crossing without him. Henry, for his part, was fighting his own battle. He had meant to stay for a week or two, help out, then move on to Douglas and find work on one of the ranches there. But Flora had gotten under his skin in a way no woman ever had. It was not just her beauty, though he thought her lovely with her dark blonde hair always escaping its braid and her gray-blue eyes that changed color with her moods. It was her strength, her determination, her refusal to give up even when the work was clearly beyond her physical limits. It was the way she was kind to her father even when he was irritable from illness, the way she looked after her brother, the way she ran this crossing with a competence that commanded respect. He was falling for her, and that complicated everything. The complication became impossible to ignore on a Tuesday morning when they had just finished bringing a freight wagon across. The driver paid his toll and moved on, and Flora was coiling the spare rope when she suddenly swayed on her feet. Henry caught her before she could fall, his hands closing around her arms. "When did you last eat?" he demanded. "I had coffee this morning," Flora said, trying to pull away, but he did not let go. "Coffee is not food. Come on." He guided her to the small shelter they had built near the ferry landing and made her sit down. From his saddlebag, which he now kept near the crossing, he produced jerky and hardtack. "Eat." "I am fine," Flora protested, but her hands shook as she reached for the jerky, betraying her. "You are not fine. You are working yourself into the ground." Henry crouched in front of her, his face level with hers. "Flora, you do not have to prove anything. Not to me, not to anyone." "I have to keep this crossing running," she said, and hated how her voice wavered. "If we lose this, we lose everything. The house, the land, all of it. My father borrowed money against the property to build the new ferry platform 2 years ago, and if we cannot make the payments, you will make the payments," Henry interrupted. "But you will not make them by starving yourself." "Eat." Flora ate and felt better for it, though she would not give him the satisfaction of saying so. But Henry saw it in her face anyway, and something in his expression softened. He reached out and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, his fingers lingering for just a moment against her cheek. "You are the stubbornest woman I have ever met," he said. but his tone made it sound like a compliment. "You did not know your mother very well, then," Flora replied, trying to lighten the suddenly charged atmosphere between them. Henry laughed, a genuine sound of amusement, and the tension broke. But something had shifted between them, an acknowledgement of what was growing in the spaces of their shared work and quiet evenings. That night, after supper, Frank announced he was going into Douglas the next day to fetch supplies and pick up medicine for their father from the doctor. "The old prescription is almost gone, and Doc Hartley said he would have a new batch ready by Wednesday." "I can go," Flora offered immediately. "You can run the ferry with Mr. Thorne." "Actually," Henry said carefully, "I was thinking I should go with Frank. The ford below Douglas is running fast right now, and it would be good to have two of us in case there is trouble. You and your father can manage the ferry for a day. The river is finally dropping." It was true. After nearly 2 weeks of sustained high water, the San Pedro had begun to recede at last. The current was still strong, but not the monster it had been. Flora and her father, who was finally well enough to leave his bed for short periods, could handle it together for a day. "All right," Flora agreed, though she felt an odd reluctance to have Henry out of her sight. She had grown accustomed to his presence, to the sound of his voice, to the way he moved through her days as if he belonged there. The next morning, Henry and Frank left before dawn, riding double on Henry's roan. Flora watched them go from the porch, her arms wrapped around herself against the early chill. Her father came to stand beside her, leaning heavily on his walking stick. "He is a good man," her father said. "Yes," Flora agreed, "you have feelings for him." It was not a question. Flora glanced at her father, then back at the empty road. "Is it that obvious? To someone who knows you, yes." Her father was quiet for a moment. "Does he feel the same?" "I do not know," Flora said honestly. "Maybe. But it does not matter. He will leave once the water goes down and you are fully recovered. He has his own life, his own plans." "Have you asked him about those plans?" Flora shook her head. "I am afraid to. What if he says he is leaving? What if I ask him to stay and he says no?" Her father put a hand on her shoulder. "And what if he says yes?" Flora had no answer for that. The day passed slowly. The ferry traffic was light, and Flora and her father managed it without too much difficulty. But Flora found herself constantly looking down the road, waiting for Henry and Frank to return. As evening approached and they did not appear, she began to worry. "They probably decided to stay in town for the night," her father said, seeing her anxiety. The ride back in the dark would be dangerous with the ford running high. Flora knew he was right, but she could not shake the uneasy feeling in her stomach. She went to bed that night but slept poorly, waking at every sound. The next morning, Frank returned alone. Flora was outside feeding the chickens when she heard the horse. She dropped the feed bucket and ran to meet him, her heart pounding. "Where is Henry?" Frank dismounted, his young face troubled. There was trouble in Douglas. Some men from the Clanton gang were in town, causing problems. Henry stepped in when they were harassing a Mexican family, and it turned into a fight. Henry held his own, but then one of them pulled a knife. Flora's blood turned to ice. He is alive," Frank said quickly, "but he took a bad cut to his side. Doc Hartley patched him up, but he said Henry should not ride for at least a few days, maybe a week. Henry wanted me to come back and tell you, so you would not worry. He is staying at the boarding house, and the doc is checking on him daily." Flora did not remember making the decision. She simply moved, going into the house and emerging moments later with her coat and a small bag. "I am going to Douglas." "Flora, you cannot," her father protested. "The ferry, you can manage it for a few days. The water is down. If it gets too busy, close it." She was already heading for the barn to saddle one of the mules. "I have to go." Her father and Frank exchanged glances, and then her father nodded. Go, but be careful. The ride to Douglas took 3 hours on the mule, and by the time Flora arrived, the sun was high overhead. She went straight to the boarding house Frank had described, a tidy whitewashed building on the edge of town. The landlady, a stern-looking woman with kind eyes, directed her to a room on the 2nd floor. Flora knocked softly, then entered when she heard Henry's voice tell her to come in. He was lying on the bed, his torso wrapped in bandages, his face pale, but his eyes lit up when he saw her. Flora, you should not have come all this way. Do not tell me what I should or should not do, Flora said, crossing to the bed. Her hands trembled as she looked him over, taking in the bandages, the drawn look around his eyes. How bad is it? Doc says I will be fine. It looks worse than it is. Henry tried to sit up and winced, putting a hand to his side. Lie still, Flora commanded, pulling the room's single chair close to the bed and sitting down. What happened? Henry told her, his voice roughening when he described the Clanton men threatening the Mexican family, the father and his young daughter who had only been trying to buy supplies. I could not just stand there and watch it. You understand that, do not you? Of course I do, Flora said. You did the right thing, but you could have been killed. But I was not. Henry reached out and took her hand, his thumb tracing circles on her palm. Flora, I am all right. Flora looked down at their joined hands, then back up at his face. When Frank came back without you, I thought, her voice broke, and she had to stop. Hey, Henry said softly. He tugged her hand gently, pulling her closer. I am here. I am all right. Flora found herself leaning forward, her forehead almost touching his. I was so scared, she whispered. Henry, I know, he said. I know because I feel it too. Flora, I have been trying to figure out how to tell you how to ask what, if I could stay. Not just until the river goes down or your father recovers. Stay for good, with you. Flora pulled back just enough to see his face clearly. You want to stay? I have not wanted to leave since about the 3rd day I was there, Henry admitted. But I did not know if you felt the same, if you would want me around permanently, if Flora kissed him. It was impulsive and probably improper, kissing an injured man in a boarding house room, but she did not care. She kissed him, and he kissed her back, his hand coming up to cup her cheek. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Henry was smiling. I will take that as a yes. Yes, Flora said. Yes, stay, please stay. I do not have much, Henry warned. Some savings, my horse, my gear. I can find work on one of the ranches around here, bring in wages, but we will figure it out together, Flora said. We have been doing that since you arrived. Why stop now? Henry laughed, then winced again. You will have to stop making me laugh for a few days. Doc says it is bad for the stitches. Flora smiled and kissed him again, more gently this time. I will try. She stayed in Douglas for 3 days until the doctor pronounced Henry well enough to travel slowly. She spent those days at his bedside, talking about everything, their hopes, their pasts, their plans for the future. Henry told her about growing up on the ferry in Missouri, about watching his mother work herself to exhaustion, about his years of drifting through the territory. Flora told him about her mother's death, about taking over more and more of the ferry work as her father aged, about her fears and her dreams. On the 3rd evening, as they sat together watching the sunset through the boarding house window, Henry said, "Marry me." Flora turned to look at him, her heart skipping. "What? Marry me?" Henry repeated. "I know it is fast, and I know I should probably wait until I am healed and can court you properly, but Flora, I love you. I think I have loved you since I saw you standing on that ferry, too stubborn to admit you needed help. Marry me, and let me spend the rest of my life helping you run that crossing, building a life with you." Flora felt tears prick her eyes, but they were happy tears. "Yes," she said. "Yes, I will marry you." They rowed back to the ferry crossing 4 days after Flora had left, Henry moving carefully but growing stronger every day. When they arrived, Flora's father took one look at their joined hands and their matching smiles, and he started laughing. "I told you to ask him about his plans," he said to Flora. "I did," Flora replied. "He is staying." "I am doing more than that, sir," Henry said, standing as straight as his healing side would allow. "I am asking your permission to marry your daughter." Flora's father studied Henry for a long moment, then extended his hand. "You have it. Welcome to the family, son." They were married a month later in a simple ceremony at the small church in Douglas. Frank stood as a witness, along with the doctor who had patched Henry up, and the Mexican man, whose family Henry had defended, a man named Rodrigo Santos, who had become a friend. Flora wore her mother's wedding dress, altered to fit, and Henry wore new clothes purchased with some of his savings, though he felt strange in them. The river had returned to its normal levels by then, and the ferry crossing ran smoothly under their combined management. Henry proved to be as skilled at the business side as he was at the physical work, and between them, they managed to not only make the land payments but save a little besides. He found occasional work on nearby ranches when the ferry was slow, and Flora's father, his health much improved, helped when he could. The first year of their marriage was hard work, but happy. Flora and Henry learned each other's rhythms, not just in work but in all aspects of life. They learned how to argue productively, how to support each other through difficult days, how to celebrate small victories. They learned that they were stronger together than either had been alone. In the spring of 1884, Flora discovered she was pregnant. She told Henry one evening as they sat on the porch, the place where they had first begun to know each other. "A baby," Henry repeated, his face cycling through surprise, joy, and panic in rapid succession. "We are going to have a baby." "We are," Flora confirmed, taking his hand and placing it on her still flat stomach. "Are you happy?" "Happy." Henry pulled her into his arms, mindful of being gentle. "Flora, I am terrified and thrilled and happier than I knew was possible. A baby, our baby." Their son was born in December, during a cold snap that frosted the windows and made the river steam in the mornings. They named him William, after Flora's father, whose full name was William Frederick. The baby had his father's dark hair and his mother's gray-blue eyes, and from the moment Henry held him, he was completely besotted. Flora's father, grandfather now, seemed to grow younger with William's arrival. He spent hours with the baby, telling him stories about the river and the crossing, about Flora's mother, about the early days of the territory. Frank, now 18 and courting a girl from Douglas, proved to be a surprisingly capable uncle, gentle with the baby despite his still gangly frame. The ferry crossing continued to be their livelihood, but Henry and Flora began to expand. They bought 2 more mules and started running a small freight service on the side, carrying goods between Douglas and the settlements to the north. The extra income allowed them to hire occasional help with the ferry, giving them more time with William and each other. When William was 2, Flora found herself pregnant again. This time there was less panic and more quiet joy. Their daughter, Sarah, was born in August of 1886, during a thunderstorm that lit up the sky and made the horses nervous. She had Flora's blonde hair and Henry's determined chin, and she proved from the start to be every bit as stubborn as her parents. "We make strong-willed children," Henry observed one evening, watching as 3-year-old William argued with his mother about bedtime while baby Sarah screamed her displeasure at being in her cradle instead of her mother's arms. "I wonder where they get it," Flora said dryly, but she was smiling as she picked up Sarah and handed William to his father. "You take the negotiator, I will take the screamer." Henry laughed and carried William off to bed, beginning the nightly ritual of stories and songs that had become their tradition. Flora nursed Sarah in the rocking chair Henry had made, humming softly, marveling as she often did at how much her life had changed since that spring day 4 years ago when her arms had shaken from hauling the ferry rope and a stranger had grabbed hold to help. Not a stranger anymore. Her husband. Her partner. The father of her children. The man who had seen her at her most vulnerable and chosen to stay. As the children grew, they became part of the ferry operation. William, serious and methodical even as a small child, loved to help his father check the ropes and oil the pulleys. Sarah, wild and fearless, had to be watched constantly to keep her from climbing on the ferry platform or trying to feed the mules things they should not eat. Frank married his sweetheart, a quiet girl named Anna, and they built a small house just up the road, and Frank took over more and more of the freight business. Flora's father passed peacefully in his sleep in the winter of 1888, and though they mourned him, they took comfort in knowing he had lived to see his grandchildren, and to know that the ferry he had built would continue in capable hands. They buried him on the hill overlooking the crossing, where he could always watch the river he had loved. The territory was changing too. The railroad was pushing farther into Arizona, bringing more people, more commerce, more growth. Douglas was becoming a real town, with streets and shops and a school. Henry and Flora sent William to that school when he turned 6, and later Sarah, though Sarah complained bitterly about having to sit still all day. In 1891, Flora found herself pregnant for a third time, a surprise given that she was now 30 years old and had thought her childbearing days might be over. This pregnancy was harder than the others, and Henry worried constantly, but Flora was stubborn as ever, continuing to work the ferry until her 8th month when Henry finally put his foot down. "You are staying in the house," he said firmly. "William and I can run the ferry. Frank can help." "You are resting." "I am pregnant, not dying," Flora protested. "And you are going to stay that way by resting," Henry countered. "Flora, please, I cannot lose you." The fear in his voice made her relent. She rested, and in April of 1892 she delivered a healthy baby boy they named Thomas. He was the easiest of their babies, content to sleep and eat and watch the world with calm interest. And Henry joked that at least one of their children had inherited some kind of peaceful nature, even if they had no idea from whom. The years continued to unfold, bringing the small joys and challenges of family life. William grew tall and steady, taking after his grandfather. He developed a gift for working with wood and began building furniture in his spare time, pieces that were simple and strong and beautiful. Sarah grew wild and free, riding horses better than any boy her age, helping with the freight business, arguing with anyone who suggested she should be more ladylike. Thomas toddled after his older siblings, happy to be included in whatever they were doing. Henry and Flora, now in their 30s, settled into a comfortable partnership that had only deepened with time. They still ran the ferry together, though they had hired permanent help now, a young man named Jack who was saving money to buy his own place. They still sat on the porch in the evenings, though now they were often joined by children climbing into their laps or playing at their feet. They still talked about everything and nothing, finishing each other's sentences, communicating as much with looks as with words. "Do you remember that first day?" Flora asked one evening in 1895 as they watched the sun set over the river. William was 13 now, Sarah 9, Thomas 3, and all of them were busy playing some complicated game that involved the chickens and a wooden wagon. "I remember thinking you were going to pull yourself right off that ferry platform if you did not let go of the rope," Henry replied. "I remember your arms shaking. I remember thinking about my mother. I remember being terrified you would see how scared I was," Flora said. "And then you did see, and you stayed anyway." "Best decision I ever made," Henry said, pulling her close. "Well, that and asking you to marry me." "I seem to recall I kissed you before you finished asking," Flora teased. "You have always been impatient," Henry agreed, and kissed her, long and sweet, until Sarah made exaggerated gagging noises and William told her to hush and let their parents be. In 1896, Arizona Territory was growing rapidly toward eventual statehood, though that was still years away. The ferry crossing saw more traffic than ever, and Henry and Flora began to discuss building a bridge. It would be expensive, requiring engineers and materials and time, but it would also be permanent, secure, a legacy for their children. They started planning, saving money, talking to builders. It would take years, they knew, but they had time. They were still young enough, still strong enough, still determined enough to see it through. Frank and Anna had 3 children of their own by then, and the extended family gathered often for meals and celebrations. Frank had expanded the freight business to include a small trading post, and it was doing well enough that he could support his family comfortably. He credited Henry for teaching him about business, about how to treat customers fairly and build relationships, rather than just chasing profits. "You taught me that staying in one place and building something lasting is worth more than chasing quick money," Frank told Henry one evening. "I would have left, if you had not come along. I would have run off to seek my fortune and probably ended up broke in some mining camp. You showed me a different way." Henry, uncomfortable with such direct praise, just clapped Frank on the shoulder. "You did the work yourself. I just helped a little." But Flora, overhearing, caught Henry's eye and smiled. He had helped more than a little. He had saved their family, saved the ferry, and stayed to build a life that touched everyone around him. The bridge became a reality in 1899, a sturdy wooden structure engineered to withstand the spring floods. The ferry remained in operation beside it for those who preferred the old way or who needed to transport very heavy loads, but the bridge made crossing the San Pedro infinitely easier. Henry and Flora stood on the bridge the day it opened, their children clustered around them and looked down at the river that had brought them together. "We did it," Flora said softly. "We did," Henry agreed. "Together." As the new century approached, Henry and Flora began to step back from the day-to-day operation of the crossing. William, now 17, had taken over much of the management, showing the same steady competence his parents had. Sarah, at 13, was splitting her time between helping with the freight business and training horses, having discovered she had a real talent for it. Thomas, at 7, was still deciding what interested him most, though he loved working with his hands like William. Henry took up ranching on a small scale, buying some land adjacent to the crossing and running a modest herd of cattle. It gave him something to do and brought in additional income, though truthfully they did not need it anymore. The ferry, the bridge, the freight business, and the trading post all generated enough money to keep the family comfortable. Flora focused on the community, helping to establish a proper school in Douglas, working with other women to create a library, involving herself in the kind of civic work that made a town into something more than just a collection of buildings. She had a gift for organization and diplomacy, and people respected her opinion, but they always made time for each other. Date nights, they called them, evenings when they would leave the children with Frank and Anna and ride out to a favorite spot by the river, or into Douglas for dinner at the hotel restaurant. They would talk and laugh and remember, and then they would go home and love each other with the passion that had never faded, even after nearly 2 decades of marriage. In 1900, Flora turned 39 and Henry turned 42. They celebrated quietly, with family, reflecting on how much had changed and how much had stayed the same. Their marriage had weathered storms both literal and figurative. They had faced financial troubles, illness, the loss of Flora's father, the challenges of raising children and running businesses in a harsh land. But they had faced all of it together, and that had made all the difference. "If I could go back," Henry said one night as they lay in bed, "to that day when I saw you on the ferry, knowing everything that would happen, all the hard times and the good ones, I would still grab that rope. I would still ask to stay. I would still choose you every single time." Flora turned to face him, her hand on his cheek. "I would still say yes, to all of it, to you." They made love then, with the tenderness of long familiarity and the passion that still flared between them. And afterwards, as Flora drowsed against Henry's shoulder, she thought about the course of a life, about how a single moment could change everything. About how strong arms and a rope and a willingness to help a stranger had led to this, to love, to family, to a life richer than she had ever imagined possible. The years continued their steady march. William married at 20, a smart young woman named Catherine who had moved to Douglas to teach at the school. They gave Henry and Flora their first grandchild in 1903, a baby girl named Flora after her grandmother, and Flora held the tiny infant and cried happy tears. Sarah, predictably, did not marry young. She was too busy with her horses and her freight runs and her absolute refusal to conform to anyone's expectations of what a woman should be. But at 21, she met a cowboy named James Harrison who was every bit as stubborn and independent as she was, and somehow they made it work. They married in 1904, in a ceremony that was equal parts chaotic and joyful, with Sarah wearing trousers under her dress because she refused to ride side saddle even on her wedding day. Thomas, quiet and creative, apprenticed with a carpenter in Douglas and proved to have inherited William's gift for woodworking, along with an artistic flair all his own. He created beautiful furniture and decorative pieces that people came from all over the territory to purchase. At 18, he was already making a name for himself. Henry and Flora, now in their mid-40s, found themselves with the time and freedom they had not had in years. The businesses ran themselves with their children and hired help managing the day-to-day operations. They could travel a little, visit other parts of the territory, spend time with their growing collection of grandchildren, but they always came back to the crossing, to the house on the hill overlooking the San Pedro River. It was home in a way no other place could ever be. It was where they had met, where they had built their life, where they had raised their children and weathered their storms. In 1906, on the anniversary of the day they met, a date they celebrated privately each year, Henry took Flora back to the ferry crossing. The ferry itself was rarely used anymore, the bridge having taken over most of the traffic, but they kept it in good repair for nostalgia and for the occasional user who preferred it. "Stand there," Henry said, positioning Flora where she had been that first day. "Right there, holding the rope." Flora humored him, taking hold of the ferry rope. "Like this?" "Exactly like that," Henry said. He walked to where he had been standing on the bank, then mimed wading into the water and grabbing the rope. "I have got it," he called out, echoing his words from nearly a quarter-century before. "Keep pulling, but let me take the weight," Flora laughed, the sound carrying across the water. "We are ridiculous. We are in love," Henry corrected, walking back to her and taking her hands. "And I wanted to remember it exactly how it was, what I felt." "What did you feel?" Flora asked. "That I had to help you," Henry said. That I could not just ride on and leave you struggling alone, and then, within a day or two, that I never wanted to leave at all. You got into my heart so fast, Flora. You are still there, taking up all the space, leaving room for nothing else." Flora kissed him there on the ferry platform, with the sun bright overhead and the river running calm and clear below them. "You are in my heart too," she whispered against his lips. "You have been since you grabbed that rope and stayed." They stood there for a long time, wrapped in each other's arms, letting the memories wash over them. The fear and exhaustion of that first day, the slow building of trust and friendship, the moment in the boarding house when everything had changed. The wedding, the children, the years of hard work and deep love. "We should probably go back," Flora said eventually. "The grandchildren will be waiting." "Let them wait," Henry said. "I want to stay here a little longer with you where it all began." So they stayed, and the river flowed past them as it had flowed for centuries and would flow for centuries more, carrying water from the mountains to the desert, constant and changing all at once. Like love, like marriage. Like the life they had built together from that first moment when their hands had met on a rope and held on tight, refusing to let go. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, they finally left the ferry and walked back up the hill to the house. Lights glowed in the windows, and they could hear the sounds of family inside, children laughing, voices calling, the clatter of dishes and the warm hum of people who belonged together. Henry paused at the door, pulling Flora back for one more kiss. "Thank you," he said. "For what?" "For letting me stay, for saying yes, for building this life with me." "Thank you for grabbing the rope," Flora replied. "For seeing that I needed help and giving it freely, for loving me." "Always," Henry promised. "I will always love you." They went inside together, into the warmth and light and love they had created. Their children greeted them, their grandchildren clamored for attention, and the evening unfolded in the comfortable chaos of a large family gathering. But throughout it all, Henry and Flora remained connected, their eyes meeting across the room, their hands finding each other in the crowd, their love as strong and steady as the rope that had first brought them together. Years later, when they were old and gray, when their children had children of their own and the ferry crossing had become a piece of local history preserved more for sentiment than use, Henry and Flora would still walk down to the river. They would stand on the bridge they had built or on the ferry platform that had been the site of their meeting, and they would remember. They would remember the spring of 1882, when the San Pedro River ran high and wild with snowmelt. They would remember strong arms and shaking hands, and a rope stretched across churning water. They would remember the moment when a stranger became a friend, when a friend became a love, when a love became a life. And they would be grateful, every single day, for the flood that had brought them together and the love that had kept them that way. In 1920, at Flora's 60th birthday celebration, surrounded by children and grandchildren and even a few great-grandchildren, someone asked her what the secret was to such a long and happy marriage. Flora looked at Henry, who was 63 now, his hair completely gray, his face lined with years of sun and work and laughter. He was still strong, still steady, still the man who had grabbed a rope and changed her life. "The secret," Flora said, taking Henry's hand, "is finding someone who sees you struggling and does not just offer help, but stays to see it through. Who does not just love you when things are easy, but who holds on tight when the current is strong. Who chooses you every single day the way you choose them." Henry squeezed her hand. "The secret is falling in love with your best friend," he added, "and never falling out." "The secret," said William, their eldest, "is that they are still disgustingly in love after almost 40 years of marriage." Everyone laughed, but Flora and Henry just smiled at each other because it was true. They were still in love, deeply and completely, the kind of love that only comes from weathering life's storms together and coming through stronger for it. As the party continued around them, Henry leaned close to Flora and whispered, "Want to sneak away and go down to the river?" "Always," Flora replied. They slipped out quietly, walking hand in hand down the familiar path to the crossing. The bridge stood solid and strong in the moonlight, a testament to what they had built. The old ferry platform was still there too, maintained now more as a historical monument than a working vessel. They stood together in the spot where they had first worked side by side, and Henry wrapped his arms around Flora from behind, resting his chin on her shoulder. "You ever regret it?" he asked. "Tying yourself to a drifter with nothing but a horse and some savings?" "Never," Flora said firmly. "You brought me everything I needed. Love, partnership, family, a life fuller than I ever dreamed possible. Do you regret stopping?" "You could have ridden on to Douglas that day, found work, lived a different life." "If I had ridden past you that day, I would have regretted it every moment of my life after," Henry said. "You were meant to be mine, Flora. I knew it the second I grabbed that rope. I knew it in my bones." "We were meant to be each other's," Flora corrected, turning in his arms to face him. "Two halves of the same whole." They kissed there in the moonlight, beside the river that had brought them together, on the ferry platform where their story had begun. And though they were old now, though their bodies bore the marks of 6 decades of living, the love between them was as young and vital as it had been that first day. Because true love, the kind that weathers floods and hardship and all the small and large challenges of building a life together, does not diminish with time. It grows stronger, deeper, more essential with each passing year. Henry and Flora lived many more years together, well into their 70s, watching their family grow and flourish, watching Douglas grow from a rough frontier town into an established city, watching the territory become a state. They saw automobiles replace horses on many roads, though the ferry crossing, now a protected historical site, remained accessible only by the old bridge and the even older ferry. They saw their grandchildren grow up, and their great-grandchildren born. They saw William's furniture business expand into a real factory, saw Sarah's horse training operation become renowned throughout the state, saw Thomas's artwork displayed in galleries. They saw all of it together, because they were always together. Not in a smothering way, but in the way of two people who had chosen each other and kept choosing each other, who had built a life so intertwined that being apart felt unnatural. When Henry passed peacefully in his sleep at 79, Flora grieved deeply, but not without hope. She knew with absolute certainty that what they had shared was not ended, merely paused. She lived another 3 years, surrounded by her loving family, still sharp and engaged with life, still walking down to the river every evening to watch the sunset and talk to Henry as if he were there beside her. Because, in all the ways that mattered, he was. When Flora passed at 82, they buried her next to Henry on the hill overlooking the crossing, near her father. The headstone was simple, bearing both their names and one inscription chosen by their children: 2 hands on one rope forever. The ferry crossing remained in the family for generations, eventually becoming a museum dedicated to the early days of Arizona Territory. The original ferry platform was preserved, and the story of Henry and Flora became local legend: the drifter and the ferry girl who had met during a flood and built an empire of love and family. Couples would come to visit the site, would stand on the ferry platform and hold the old rope, would make wishes for love as strong as Henry and Flora's. The bridge they had built still stood, reinforced and modernized over the years, but essentially unchanged. The river still flowed, sometimes calm, sometimes wild, always moving, always constant. And though the people who had met there were gone, their love remained, woven into the very fabric of the place. You could feel it if you stood quietly at the crossing at sunset. You could sense it in the way the light hit the water, in the creak of the old ferry platform, in the strength of the bridge that had weathered a century of floods. Love like Henry and Flora's does not fade. It becomes part of the landscape, part of the history, part of the story that people tell to remind themselves that true love exists. That two people can meet in the most unlikely circumstances and build something that lasts forever. That sometimes, all it takes is the willingness to grab a rope when someone needs help, to stay when you could leave, to choose love over and over again until choosing becomes as natural as breathing. The San Pedro River still flows through Douglas, Arizona. The bridge still stands. And if you listen carefully on quiet evenings, some say you can still hear the echo of two voices, laughing together, loving together, living the proof that the best stories are the ones that are true. This is the story of how a cowboy saw a woman struggling and grabbed a rope, and how that simple act of kindness became a love story for the ages. This is the story of Henry and Flora, of flood season and ferry crossings, of strong arms and stronger hearts. This is the story of two people who met when she needed help and who built a life on the foundation of that first moment of connection. It is a story that deserves to be told and retold, passed down through generations, remembered whenever someone wonders if true love really exists, because it does. It did. It will. And it all began with shaking arms, a churning river, and a cowboy who grabbed a rope and held on tight, choosing love before he even knew that was what he was choosing. Choosing her. Choosing them. Choosing a future that would become a legacy. Forever and always. Two hands on one rope, pulling together through whatever floods may come.